Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. We begin by seeing a man grabbing a camping backpack and running through chaotic alleys. As he runs, distant explosion sounds and a siren can be heard. The man, named Paul, stops tired and listens to the distant cries of despair from a crowd of people. He continues running, distancing himself, and the screams continue. Far enough, he looks and sees a desolate scene as if from a war. After walking a bit more and already exhausted, he enters a place where he finds two babies on a mattress, quickly picking them up and saying it's okay. 15 years later, Paul is in a field, near sunset, seemingly waiting anxiously for someone. Beside him, a boy named Joseph calls his dog inside while Paul continues waiting outside. In the middle of the forest, another young man runs breathlessly and hurriedly, as if fearing something. Inside the house and after securing a window with a wooden reinforcement, Joseph shouts to Paul that the sun was already quite low. With this, Paul, still anxious, feels obligated to run to where he was looking, but he stops when he sees the other young man, whom we saw earlier running in the forest, appear. The young man is named Thomas and apologizes to Paul for being late. Here we already realize they are the two babies, now grown, that Paul found 15 years ago. After they also enter the house, they close all the remaining doors and windows. After making sure the boys have closed everything, Paul calls them for dinner. While they eat, Paul scolds Thomas for being late and warns him that if he does it again, he won't be allowed to leave anymore. Thomas apologizes again, and they resume dinner. But soon they are interrupted again by an argument that Joseph starts with Thomas, to the point of almost coming to blows, but Paul intervenes and orders them to stop. After dinner, while they relax upstairs, their dog starts acting strange, and soon they all realize something is wrong. Thomas cautiously goes to the back door of the house, when suddenly strong knocks on it begin. Paul, who was right behind, quickly joins Thomas in trying to hold the door, as the knocks become increasingly violent. Joseph hears this from upstairs but doesn't move to help. After a few moments, the knocks cease, and everything becomes silent. Back upstairs, Thomas questions Joseph why he didn't go to help them while they were holding the door. Joseph says the doors are secure, they checked them well. So he stayed to listen and try to understand something about it. He explains that there were 3 different knocks at different times each. The first was for 10 seconds, the second for 20 seconds, and the third only 1. He then adds that for him, the first knock was like a test. The second knock, a more real attempt to break down the door, and the third, just something like frustration. The next day, Paul sees from outside how the door looks, completely filled with large and deep scratches. Moments later, while chopping wood in the forest around the house, Thomas asks his father if he could go out. Because he has something to do every day to help a neighbor named Mr. Rose, who lives nearby, and his father already knew and always allowed it. After that, Joseph has a diary in which he draws various things resembling projects. Paul even asks what he's been working on, but Joseph says it's not good yet, but it's something to help them, so they don't need to hide anymore. Paul then approaches an old quad bike and puts new parts on it, making it work and surprising Joseph. The next day around the farm, Paul is teaching the boys how to operate the vehicle. When they finish learning, Thomas again asks his father for permission to let him go to Mr. Rose's house. But this time Paul doesn't allow it, saying he needs him to help reinforce the doors of the house. They need to get wood from some trees near the river, and then Joseph goes with Thomas there. However, while still on the way, after a certain disagreement, Thomas decides to leave Joseph alone with the task, under the pretext that Joseph said he didn't need him for anything. Thomas goes down and says that at sunset, he will find him there at that point, as he is going to Mr. Rose's house. So he leaves his brother there just to fulfill the task given by his father. Thomas runs hurriedly through the forest and soon arrives at Mr. Rose's property, which is guarded. There he explains to Mrs. Rose that he was late today because he had to do some things with his father and brother. Then Mrs. Rose tells him to first drink some water before starting. Thomas goes to the well to drink when then a young woman sitting in a window nearby says it's broken. Her name is Charlotte. Thomas goes to the place to help fix something on Mr. Rose's farm, who is her father, but she says it has already been fixed. Before Thomas starts doing something else, Charlotte comes down and says she needs him to help with something else. After reinforcing the door that was scratched, Paul goes to the foot of a tree near a waterfall to relax. When he hears a rustling and looks at a hole covered with wood. At the same moment, we see Joseph arriving at a place, which is not the place his father sent him to. He attaches himself to a steel cable and descends to a lower part inside a ship stranded on an old pier. He looks for something when suddenly he sees that the place is infested with insects flying in all directions, leaving him disoriented. Meanwhile, Thomas is going with Charlotte to a tree in the middle of a field. Thomas questions her about her saying that her father needed his help for a task, but he finds out it was just so they could be alone. They spend a good time near the tree having a competition to see who can explain the end of the world in less than 10 seconds. As they play, a romantic atmosphere between them is perceived. Now we understand Thomas's desperation to go to that place every day, pretending to help Mr. Rose. Thomas realizes that the sun is about to set, so he says he has to go and will be back tomorrow. Charlotte asks him for 10 more seconds, and then hugs him before he leaves, counting down as they share that embrace. After that, Thomas rushes because he sees that the sun will soon hide on the horizon, and he still has a long way to go. At that moment, Joseph also prepares to leave, gets on his quad bike, but when he starts it, it doesn't start. He measures the distance from the sun to the horizon and starts to get apprehensive. Thomas runs hurriedly through the forest, while Paul at home is already worried about the boy's delay, so he calls his dog Rocco inside. Joseph, still on the dock, sees that the sun is getting closer and closer to setting completely, and he still hasn't been able to get his transport to start, even though he removed and replaced the part his father had put on. Then fortunately, after some insistence, he manages to start the engine and can hastily leave the place. He arrives at the place where Thomas marked for him to wait, but he hasn't arrived yet. We then see Thomas running through the forest when suddenly he steps on some loose rocks and falls into a large crack in the ground. Joseph, uncertain if his brother has already gone home or not, decides to leave because it was getting later and he couldn't stay there. When he arrives, Paul, already very worried, asks him where Thomas is, but Joseph thought he was already home. Seeing that he isn't, he tells his father that Thomas decided to go to Mr. Rose's farm, explaining that they arranged to meet at a place, but he wasn't there. Paul then hurries, grabs some things, and tells Joseph that night he will lock the house alone and that he will return with Thomas in the morning. After Paul arms himself with a knife, he calls Rocco to go with him. At that moment, we see Thomas, who is still lying at the bottom of the crack and unconscious. He wakes up and realizes the perilous situation he is in. Meanwhile, Paul runs through the forest with Rocco looking for any clue of Thomas. Already quite dark, Thomas moves through the crack using a lighter to try to see better in the darkness. When suddenly he hears something nearby and tries to illuminate to see what it is. When he sees that it is a bizarre creature, with huge claws and red eyes looking at him from between a small space in the rocks. The creature lets out a thunderous roar that can be heard where Paul is. Joseph at home waits anxiously when suddenly he hears the sound of wood creaking and realizes it's right at the window in front of him. Thomas is lying on the ground, while he hears the low growl of the creature nearby. Cautiously, he then takes a knife from his jacket pocket and stabs the creature's hand, which grunts in pain. Another creature from above grabs Thomas by the head, who tries to injure it with the lighter, but without success. Soon Paul arrives at the scene and manages to wound and kill the creature that was outside the crack, thus freeing Thomas. Paul manages to enter and embraces his relieved son. Paul sees that Thomas had a concussion from the fall and decides they will spend the night there. But before, they need to close the side where he entered, as the top, where the creature was reaching in to grab Thomas, doesn't need to be closed, as it is too narrow. Later that night, Joseph sleeps sitting in a chair facing the door, which was quite damaged the other day by the creatures trying to knock it down. However, at a certain moment, something from the other side manages to open the small opening used for looking inside. The creature extends a strange arm inside, unfolding and growing larger. But seeing that it wouldn't be enough to reach Joseph, who is still asleep, the creature makes one of its claws grow and uses it to try to reach Joseph. Seeing that this also wasn't enough, the creature, showing a certain intelligence, then unlocks and opens the door. As it enters slowly to grab Joseph, he shows he's awake and was waiting for this, quickly triggering a trap that manages to ensnare the creature. Meanwhile, Paul and Thomas in the crack hear something strange. Paul checks and finds that there's something behind the rocks they placed blocking the entrance for the monsters. But as soon as he looks and sees that one of the creatures is fleeing, they hear an even worse noise and notice that it's coming from below. Paul then hurries and realizes that the creatures are now coming from below. So he grabs his flare gun along with some dynamite and throws it into the hole the monsters are making further down, causing an explosion. Soon we see Joseph waking up and looking through the door, seeing that it's already daytime. He grabs his transport and sets off to look for his father and brother. Thomas and Paul luckily survive. Thomas pulls his father through an opening in the cave they were in, and soon Joseph manages to find them. They take him home and lay him down to see if resting will help him recover. After that, in his room, Thomas notices a noise coming from something under a cloth, and Joseph says it's one of the monsters he managed to capture the night before. Thomas tries to see the creature, but Joseph stops him. Then they proceed to bandage their father's arm, and meanwhile, Thomas recounts what happened the previous night. Finally, Thomas decides to return to where the monster is to kill it, but Joseph keeps trying to stop him. It's then, accidentally, that they end up letting the creature out, but since it can't stand sunlight, the monster hides in a dark corner of the room. However, the creature soon rises and confronts the boys. Rocco arrives at that moment and attacks the creature, which jumps on the bed and tries to attack the brothers. However, Joseph manages to pin the creature down, while Thomas grabs an axe and kills it. Joseph becomes disheartened, as he wanted to study the monster. Seeing their father's condition, which is not good, they decide to take him to Mr. Rose's farm, as Thomas believes he can be better cared for there. The brothers then put their father in the transport and head there. However, when they arrive, Mr. and Mrs. Rose don't allow them to enter, claiming that the place doesn't have enough space or supplies for something as serious as that. Charlotte contradicts her mother at that moment, saying there is space, but Mrs. Rose doesn't change her mind. She says the best she can do is allow Thomas to stay there to leave more supplies at Paul's house for his recovery. Joseph then returns disappointed to the transport, and Thomas follows suit. But again, they have a disagreement and start to fight, as Joseph blames Thomas for what happened. However, Joseph soon gets up and heads back home with his father, while Thomas stays. Charlotte takes Thomas to where he will sleep, and there he talks about his discontent with everything but says the only thing that makes him smile is her. They kiss, and Mr. Rose arrives at that moment catching them, then orders Charlotte to go with him. At that moment, Joseph arrives at his house with his father and notices some different things there. So he hurries to do something in the garage workshop. Thomas tries to find some medicine to take to his father, but Charlotte sees him and asks what he's doing. He convinces her that he needs to take some medicine to his father or he might die. While they talk, a local resident overhears everything. Charlotte then hands him the medicine, and then Thomas assures her he'll be back. Moments later, while still inside the farm, Thomas is surprised by the man who overheard his conversation with Charlotte, and the man takes him to a place, threatening him with a gun. At that moment, Joseph notices that the floor is caving in at some points and sees that it's the creatures that are now burrowing underneath, realizing it's no longer safe to be downstairs. Meanwhile, at the Rose farm, the man who took Thomas is tying him up in a barn and has called other men to punish Thomas. He says he'll punish him for stealing and lying, then prepares his shotgun to shoot Thomas in the leg. But suddenly, the ground beneath him gives way, and he falls into a deep hole. One of the men looks to see what happened when suddenly he is attacked by one of the creatures, which drags him away. At that same moment, Mr. Rose wakes up in the room with his wife, sensing that something strange is happening. He then says he'll go out to check, when at that moment one of the creatures suddenly emerges and attacks him. The creature then also goes after Mrs. Rose, and her husband tries to defend her. In desperation, a candle falls onto a curtain and starts burning it. Mrs. Rose then runs desperately to where her daughter Charlotte is, but is stopped by another monster that stands over her and starts moving bizarrely, opening its belly, revealing a sinister mouth with which it attacks Mrs. Rose. Charlotte from her room hears the noises and goes outside to see what's happening. She sees a trail of blood and, following it, finds one of the creatures all deformed, as if it had been opened. Seeing the bizarre scene, Charlotte screams, and the creature, which seemed to be dead, shows itself still alive. At that same moment, in the barn, the men struggle to retrieve their colleague from the creature. However, more creatures keep emerging and taking the men away, while Thomas begs to be untied from there. Two men manage to open the door to flee but are met with something even more bizarre, several creatures rolling toward them like a wheel. The men are eliminated one by one, and when Thomas finally manages to free himself, one of the monsters stops in front of him and starts making a terrible movement, producing a very loud noise. But at that moment, Charlotte arrives shooting at the thing and saves Thomas, then takes him away from there. As they leave, Thomas sees Charlotte's house completely engulfed in flames. He tries to run to help her parents, but she says there's no one left to save and that they need to leave now. Joseph at home blocks several pieces of furniture to cover the hole the creatures made, then goes to check on his father. He hears noises coming from upstairs and goes to check, but before he can go up, another noise, now at the door, begins. He quickly discovers it's only Thomas along with Charlotte who somehow managed to get there without being killed by the monsters. After explaining everything that happened, Thomas and Joseph go to give the medicine to their father, who had already woken up. Joseph says the creatures dug underneath the house, and at any moment they'll come in through the floor. So he asks his father what they should do, to which he promptly responds, "Fight." Joseph then goes to the workshop in the garage and asks his brother and Charlotte to help him with something. They grab some gasoline cans when Rocco starts barking, signaling that something's wrong nearby. Joseph continues to ask his brother to grab some things with him, insisting he trust his idea. While Joseph prepares something upstairs, Thomas and Charlotte stand guard at the entrance downstairs. When suddenly, a movement is noticed coming from the hole Joseph had blocked, and they prepare to face whatever comes. Where Paul is, one of the creatures starts descending from the ceiling and silently approaches him. Downstairs, Thomas tries to attack one of the monsters from behind but without success and is caught. At that moment, another monster appears and starts making the bizarre movement, but Charlotte shoots it, killing it instantly. They run upstairs, with another creature chasing them. Joseph says they need to get all the creatures inside the house because it's part of the plan. While the boys move, Paul appears all bloodied, indicating he had a fight with one of the creatures and won. He takes the gun from Charlotte and shoots the hallway floor a few times, making it weak. The boys bring something to the room, and soon several creatures emerge to grab them, but when one advances, Paul manages to kill it with a bat. However, all the others gather and come at Paul all at once. But since the floor was weakened due to the shots, they all fall to the lower floor, leaving only one. The monster tries to grab Paul, but soon his sons arrive and together kill the creature. They enter the room to finally put the plan into action, but when everyone's inside, Paul closes the door from the outside and waits for the creatures to give his sons time to save themselves in the explosion, since he also knows he wouldn't fit in the freezer with them. The improvised fuse Joseph made ignites and starts a fire. At the moment the monsters advance toward Paul, the house explodes. The strong explosion makes the freezer with the boys inside shake violently for a few moments. When the freezer stops moving, the boys come out and call for Paul. Seeing movement among the rubble, they try to see if it might be their father, but soon realize it's actually one of the creatures. They quickly then drive away, leaving behind their house completely destroyed by the explosion, while several creatures bizarrely pile up on top of each other in flames. The boys with Charlotte are pursued by the flaming ball of creatures that formed, and almost being caught, Charlotte shoots, but to no avail. She then throws the gun and destabilizes the bizarre ball of monsters, causing them to fall onto the road. The day dawns, and after burying and mourning their loved ones near the tree at the Rose Farm, they plan what to do next. They decide to move forward to where there are other farms, hoping to find more survivors. They then get into their transport and along with Rocco, embark on this new journey.